Well, hi, welcome to the Christian Contrast, where we talk about how walking with Jesus leads us to live different than those in the world around us. And for this episode, if you're a part of LBF Church, hopefully you'll remember that not too long ago, we went through the passage in Ephesians chapter 5 that talks about husbands and wives. And we actually did 2 messages on that. If you didn't hear those, I highly encourage you to go back and listen to those, not simply because it's me, but because it's such a great passage. And if you're married, or even if marriage is anywhere on your mind, it's such a rich passage in talking about how God shows the gospel through husbands and wives. And for those of us that get to preach God's word, there's always this thing that happens where when you give the sermon, there's so much more that you want to say, but the constraints of time and focus just don't allow for it. And that's true of basically every sermon that I do. But for these 2 weeks of going through the marriage passage, I felt it like I don't ever remember feeling it. Just, gosh, there's so much more that I want to cover because there's so many questions that come up about different scenarios and about divorce and remarriage and about different fights and sort of when you handle different, it's just, there's so much to talk about that I thought I'd do at least one follow-up podcast episode on some of the things that I didn't really get a chance to talk about in the sermons. So I do encourage you, once again, if you're not part of our church or if you're not familiar with these, to listen to the sermons because it'll provide even more content than what I'm talking about here. But I came up with 4 sort of follow-up questions that either people had said, are you going to talk about this? Or that I really wanted to talk about, but I didn't get a chance to talk about, that now I'll have a little bit more time to talk about. So this is about husbands and wives. It's about marriage, and you can call it sort of frequently asked questions about the biblical teaching on marriage. And so question number 1 that I want to go over is a question of, should Christian wives submit to non-Christian husbands? This comes from the idea that not only in Ephesians 5, but in several passages in the New Testament, Ephesians 5, Colossians 3, Titus 2, 1 Peter 3, which we'll look at in a minute, talks about the idea of wives submitting to husbands, which I won't get way into. Listen to the other sermons to get the full lowdown on that. But one of the questions that comes out is, well, what about a Christian wife that's married to a non-Christian husband? Like, if this whole idea of submission and headship revolves around the fact that in marriage, the gospel is meant to be shown off by the husband taking on the role of Christ and being the sacrificial head of the family and sacrificing in love for his wife and for his family. I mean, if he's not doing that, he's not a Christian, he's not committed to Christ, is the wife still called to submit to her husband? And what I'll say is the short answer on this is yes. And I'll also throw out, the commands in Ephesians 5 are wives submit to husbands and husbands love your wives. I've never heard anybody ask, now does a husband still have to love his non-Christian wife? We would feel very foolish asking that question. The obvious answer is, well, yes, of course, he's still called to love his non-Christian wife. Wives are still called to submit to their non-Christian husbands. In fact, in 1 Peter chapter 3, Peter addresses this very specific issue. I'll read just the first 2 verses of 1 Peter 3. He says, wives, in the same way, submit yourselves to your own husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives when they see the purity and reverence of your lives. So we don't even have to guess. We don't have to surmise. We don't have to make connections. Well, this passage says this, and so it also would cover this. We have a passage in the New Testament where Peter just says, hey, wives, if you're in the situation where your husband's not a Christian, where he doesn't believe the word being the gospel message. If he doesn't believe, your calling is to submit to your husband. And a big part of this that he says is so that they will be won over through the purity of your lives. He even talks later on in the same passage just about the whole idea of seeking to win the non-Christian husband over without words, but instead with behavior. I think in some ways saying, all right, the main way that you're going to show a picture of the gospel that's going to be appealing to your husband is probably not through constantly talking to him about how he should believe this thing, even though you certainly want to present the gospel to him, especially if he's responsive and open to talking about it, but the idea that you're pure, godly behavior will be what's a signal to him. So we get the big answer on this. On top of this, if we were looking for another passage that addresses this broadly, I'll turn over real quick to 1 Corinthians chapter 7, because in this passage, Paul is speaking about many things, but partly about marriage and about Christians who are married to unbelievers. So he says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, verses 12 through 14. To the rest, I say this, I, not the Lord, which, by the way, just means Paul is saying, I'm not quoting Jesus here. I'm speaking words of scriptural guidance, but they're not specifically from Jesus because he previously had quoted Jesus. He says, if any brother has a wife who is not a believer and she is willing to live with him, he must not divorce her. And if a woman has a husband who is not a believer and he is willing to live with her, she must not divorce him. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, and the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. So I'll look to do this quick because there's a whole other podcast right in there. What he's doing here is something that's really cool, because in Jewish law, when it came to being clean or being unclean ceremonially, if a clean thing and an unclean thing met, the unclean thing would make the clean thing unclean. Like sort of, that's the way it would work. What Paul is saying here is, all right, if we're taking this whole idea of cleanliness and using it as an illustration in marriage, all right, you got the unbeliever unclean, you got the believer clean. When they come together, he says the clean wins out over the unclean. You are purifying your unbelieving spouse, which doesn't mean that they're saved, but means that you are having an influence over them that's positive. He even talks about, the children of this receiving holiness or sort of being set apart because one of the spouses is a believer, which doesn't mean that the children will automatically be Christians. It just means this, and this is why I'm even talking about this. If you're in a marriage and you're a Christian and you're married to a non-Christian, that is a real marriage. That is a real marriage that, at least in a broad sense, honors God, in the sense that marriage is a gift from God and you can still function and have a very real marriage even if your spouse is a non-Christian. But let's dig in a little bit more to this. So if we're saying, all right, big picture, answer to the question is, hey, if you're a wife and you're married to an unbeliever, yes, you're still called to submit to him. If you're a man, Christian man, and you're married to an unbelieving wife, yes, you're still called to love her. Now, what does this look like, though, for a believing wife with an unbelieving husband? Because even if he's sort of a good guy, he's not going to be leading spiritually, just in the sense that he is not in tune with Christ. He's not walking with Christ, and presumably he's not claiming to walk with Christ. So what do you do in that situation where you're wanting Jesus to be at the center of your life? You're wanting Jesus to be at the center of your home. If you have children, you're wanting Jesus to be very important to them. How do you navigate all of this when your husband is not going to be exercising spiritual leadership? What does it look like to submit to him? Here's just some practical ideas about what this might look like. Number one, encourage and support his leadership and initiative in the family as a whole. This is one of the odd things that happens where we live in this age where we're very opposed to these different things. We're very opposed to the whole idea of submission and headship. We see it as regressive. And at the same time, I think we consistently see that women are looking for men who are taking the initiative, are looking for men who are going to exercise some kind of leadership in a way that's different than what men are looking for. It's not that men are necessarily specifically looking for a woman who's not a leader in any way. But that's just not something that's important to the average man to say, well, she's really good at taking initiative and at being a leader. Women crave this. It's because God has made us in a way that makes sense and that this guidance in marriage makes sense. So, all right, so if he's taken initiative in different ways to encourage that, if there's conversations that need to happen with the kids, if one of the kids is struggling, or if there's some attitude or discipline issues that need to happen with the kids, encouraging the very important role of dad in this situation. Obviously, there's going to be a lack of Christ-centered leadership, but there still can be wise, common grace guidance. The statistics about the impacts of dads on kids and on their trajectory is indisputable. So if there's just general ways that you can encourage, okay, I'm encouraging his leadership within our home in different ways, in helping provide guidance and how we're using finances and how we're navigating different discipline issues with the kids, and how we're organizing our schedules so that our priorities are right. There's a number of ways in which you can still encourage and support leadership and initiative. Beyond this, but connected to this, you can bring active support to the good things that your husband does initiate. So let's just say, here's a scenario. Let's say that your husband says, hey, I'm concerned about the kids not being active enough. Like they want to play video games, they want to eat junk food. I'm concerned about this. So I think we need to get on top of it with both nutrition and with finding ways to limit screen time, get them outside, or get them exercising in some way. You as a wife, and especially if as the wife you're sort of the more boots on the ground parent, which is often the case, it's not always the case, you can bring great practical support to this. You can say, okay, if I'm the one doing the meal planning and my husband has initiated this, and maybe it's going to be hard, but it's overall, it's a good thing to say we want our kids to be healthy nutritionally. I can bring support to that by coming up with ideas or partnering in a plan for how we're going to do this. I can help bring support to the idea that we're going to strategically think about how to limit screen time and get the kids outside. And I can make sure to follow through on the different things that we've decided in this. I can help provide rides to different sporting events if that's going to be part of it. Either way, whatever it is, you can look to bring practical support to good things that your husband initiates, showing that you're not just sort of sitting by. Submission is not the idea that you're just sort of sitting by and saying, all right, whatever you say, I guess that's what we'll do, but that you're partnering and bringing active support to that. Thirdly, just say, seek to be respectful in the way that you're looking to incorporate Christ into your family life. And this is tricky because this gets into one of those modes where, if your husband, and my experience is that this is not usually the case, but if your husband is saying, I don't want you going to church at all, that's a tough situation. And that's one that requires a lot of wisdom and guidance for figuring out what to do with that. In my experience, I very rarely have I run across a situation like that. Most times husbands are kind of like, all right, that's fine. That's your thing. That's okay. Most husbands are even fine with saying, hey, that's okay to bring the kids there and expose them to that. So most of the time, that's going to be the more normal scenario. But you want to be respectful in the ways that you're doing that. You want to even think of it, maybe you make Sunday mornings the non-negotiable where you say, this is super important to me. I don't want to, unless there's some unique scenario or a family vacation, I want to prioritize that I'm able to be there on Sundays. But maybe you talk to him before signing up for 6 other things at the church. And you say, all right, that there's a couple of Bible studies that I want to join. And maybe he's a little put off by this and is starting to feel neglected. And you decide, okay, how would you feel if I join the Monday one, but I don't do this other one? So that, what I'm saying is just think about ways to be respectful within this, to show him that this is very important to you, and at the same time to show him that he's very important to you, and that the way that you're walking with Jesus is actually an improvement to the way that you're engaging with him as a wife, in the same way that if there's a Christian husband and a non-Christian wife, that hopefully she would see, gosh, him being in these Bible studies, him being around these other Christian men and these other believers and worshiping together on Sundays, this is making him a more loving and more caring husband, that you're a more supportive and a more encouraging wife. This could go even into finances, where you're saying, all right, I want to give, and God commands us to give and to be generous with our money, but this is our money and my husband isn't on board with this, that there may be you may want to do some respectful negotiation to figure out how to do that in a way that's showing respect to him and all of that. So there are ways to do this. It definitely isn't ideal. This is why for any of you who are listening to this who aren't married yet, but you want to get married, marry a Christian. Like marry somebody who is walking with Jesus in the way that you want to walk with Jesus so that you're able to partner together in this. But if you find yourself in an unequally yoked situation, your marriage is real. Your marriage can still honor God. You can still honor God in the way that you do this. And there still is a calling for husbands to love their non-Christian wives and for wives to submit to their non-Christian husbands. So all right, that's probably the longest question. Question number 2, I did touch on this, I think, briefly in one of the sermons. Are prenuptial agreements okay? Now, you're not going to look at some verse in the Bible that specifically addresses thou shalt not have a prenuptial agreement. But on the whole, what we're talking about with a prenuptial agreement is something that's signed before marriage, some agreement that you come to that basically says, if we get divorced, here's how we're going to divvy things up, and you don't get access to this. At least stereotypically, a lot of this has been men giving their prospective wives, their fiancés, a prenuptial agreement to sign. Nowadays, I'm not sure. It may be more even, or it may be more agreed upon. There certainly would be a lot more situations now than in the past where the woman might be entering into marriage with more resources than the man. And so I'm not sure how much all of that is factoring into it, but that's what we're talking about with the prenuptial agreement. What I want to say is I am utterly and completely against these. I think that this is a terrible, terrible idea for every marriage, and certainly a terrible idea for a Christian marriage. Because the whole idea of a Christian marriage is oneness. For this reason, according to Genesis 2:24, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and they will be one flesh. The two are one flesh. You are one. You are absolutely united. The idea of going into marriage saying, all right, yeah, we're one, but I just want to make sure that you know that my stuff is still my stuff. And if you leave me, if this doesn't work out, I still want to make sure I have my stuff and you don't end up with my stuff. Now, with the increase in divorce in our culture, I can understand why people would be more cautious going into marriage. Would have more of a sense of, gosh, how do you really know? Like this might not even be up to me. I might not have any say in the divorce, because in most of the country, and certainly in California, we have no fault divorce. And so the person doesn't even, you can't sort of deny somebody a divorce in the way in years past somebody could have done that sort of thing. So this is a tricky situation, and I can have compassion. And what I'd say is, man, be really, really careful with who you marry. Be very thoughtful with who you marry. Don't marry somebody lightly without thinking about their character and their approach and their godliness. But man, what a horrible idea to go into marriage saying, well, I'm going to marry you, but I just want to make sure that you can't take advantage of me. Man, so much of conflict in marriage is based around that idea. Is based around the lack of trust for each other. Like, I don't know if I can really count on you, and so I'm going to stand up for myself. I don't know if I can really count on you, and so I'm not going to necessarily believe what you're telling me right now. That is so much of conflict in marriage. When you're going into marriage and you're saying, I'm going to marry you, I don't really know if I can count on you. I don't really know if I can trust you, and I'm going to make sure to protect myself against you. This is such a recipe for failure and disaster. And beyond this, while sadly there are situations where Christians end up in marriages where divorce does need to be on the table because of the behavior of the other spouse. We'll actually talk about this a little bit more in a few minutes. You don't want to go into marriage seeing this even as a possibility. You want to go into marriage saying, we are absolutely in it. We have to work things out because we are in this together for the rest of our lives. That ends up putting you in a position where you do work through things. So I think that this is a terrible, terrible idea to have prenuptial agreements. What I will say is this, because I've had different conversations with people, particularly in second marriages or in remarriages, where they've asked the question, and the question may revolve around like, okay, in fact, I can remember one situation where somebody who was widowed said, all right, my husband and I saved up money for our kids who are now like young adults for inheritance for them. I still want that to go to them. But now if I get remarried, is that all just going to kind of be in a pool where it's all everybody's and it's going every which way to different children? I think that that's an understandable situation. And I think that there are solutions other than prenuptial agreements. I think the best, and you could work with somebody who would help figure out, all right, is the best way to do this a trust or something else like that, but where you can say, okay, this money is earmarked for this purpose, and the two of us are agreeing upon it. We're saying, no, like that's for this purpose. That is for these adult children. That is for grandchildren. That is for this thing that previously is agreed upon. And now moving forward, for the most part, for the whole, our money is just our money. But we've agreed together, this is set aside for this purpose because of this unique situation, or to make sure that the kid's inheritance isn't put into threat in some sort of way. When you do get remarried, there's going to be some drama surrounding those things anyway, because you do have to think, as a husband, you're called to take care of your wife. And so you can't leave her high and dry if she outlives you and you're like, nope, all my money just goes to my kids and she's just sort of out of luck. You can't do that. So you gotta, one of the factors if you're getting remarried should be, all right, how is this gonna affect inheritance to kids and resources and things like that? But I think there are ways to solve this, certainly without the prenuptial agreement, so that if you are married, it's a real marriage, you're really one, you're really moving forward together in that. All right, question number 3. Question number 3 revolves around the idea of the call for respect in the Ephesians passage, where it says at the end that the husband should love his wife and the wife should respect her husband. And I guess the question is this. The question is, what is a wife to do when her husband is not respectable? And this is one of these unique things. That there's a great book by a man named Emerson Eggerichs. And he wrote a book called Love and Respect that's really based on Ephesians 5 and is based on the idea that the number one thing that the wife is yearning for is love. The number one thing that the husband is yearning for is respect, and just how we can get on a negative cycle when we're denying each other those things, and how we can get on sort of a positive, we can get positive momentum when we're giving each other those things. One of the things that he talks about in there is how everybody seems to be on board with unconditional love. Like, hey, the husband is supposed to love his wife even when she's not acting very lovable. But for some reason, when it comes to respect, we say, well, no, respect is earned. Like, love is not earned, respect is earned. Part of this is just an inconsistency that we have. For some reason, we think that the command to husbands is binding and the command to wives is not. But also in this, I think, is even how we think of the idea of respect. That we typically do. When we say, I respect somebody, it's typically based on who they are. And there would be other people that we would say, I don't respect that person. So there can be confusion in just saying, all right, my husband is not acting in a respectful way. What does this mean? How am I still to respect him when he's not acting in a respectable way? I think part of the answer is this. Part of the answer is that when Paul is calling wives to respect their husbands, and again, even husbands that are not Christians, the call is based, at least in part, on position. Not just on character, but on position. We all, any of us who have lived for any amount of time, have had presidents that we've been really happy with and that we voted for and that we thought were good, and then presidents that we didn't vote for and we thought were terrible. There still is a way to show respect to the office, even if you're not a big admirer of the person who's in the office. You can still refer to the person as the president. You can still show honor in the way that you talk about them, even if you're looking at their behavior and you're like, I don't respect their positions, I don't respect their behavior, but I respect the office. That's a part of the equation here, about saying, all right, like, the husband is the head of the home. The husband is your husband who you chose to marry. So you give respect simply to the position, at least in part. That's part of the equation in all of this. On top of this, the idea of respect does not mean that you respect every choice that he makes. This doesn't mean if your husband is out of work and he's not even really looking for a job and he's sitting around is playing video games and is being irresponsible, or if he's drinking too much or taking drugs or whatever it is, this doesn't mean that you have to say, oh, I respect so much how my husband lays around and doesn't work and smokes pot. That's not what Paul is talking about in this sense. You still want to give respect, and even part of the respect, and this is tricky for any wife to be in this position, part of the respect is to choose to still interact with your husband as if you believe that he could be behaving in a more respectable way. You can still look to show respect in the areas where he is acting respectable, which some of you might think there aren't any. There are different ways in which he is. There are different things for any husband. I think unless you're in the most extreme of extreme circumstances, there still are ways that you can show respect for the things that are respectable about him. But you can also show respect in the way that if you are having just a real conversation, and if you're saying, I'm struggling I'm struggling because when you're sitting around like this, when you're not taking initiative, like it's hard for me to have, I know you want my respect, and there are many ways in which I do respect you, but it's hard for me to respect you because I know what you're capable of. I know the man that I married. I know that you were made for more than this. And again, I say that those might not be the exact words that you use, but if you can communicate that sentiment, and most men, we're so longing for that from the world, but in particular from our wife. And if there is a sense of him hearing from you, my respect for you is coming through in a way that I know that you were made for better things than this. I know that you can show character that's more than this. That might be one of the ways that you show respect. You show respect for the position. You show respect for the fact that he still is doing some things that are respectable, and then you show respect by showing that you believe that there's better things that he's capable of. In a similar way, let's say, and I think this is less common, but let's say you're a husband and you're trying to love your wife, and your wife is just a very difficult wife. Maybe she is drinking a lot of alcohol. Again, maybe she is smoking pot. Maybe she's a gossip. Maybe she just has a lot of anger, whatever it is. Let's just say, hey, anybody would look at it and say, gosh, you're in a difficult position. You have a difficult wife to love. You can still pray for her. It's striking that when Jesus tells us to love our enemies, he then says, pray for those who persecute you. Prayer is a key way that we show love. So you can still love her. You can still look to take care of her. You can still speak to her and listen to her with kindness and thoughtfulness. You can look to engage with her in a way that you're setting her up for sort of the best path for her. You can even look to figure out practical ways to say, all right, these are the sorts of friends that I'm going to try to have us hang out with because they're just going to be the sorts of friends that will give her a vision for something different than the way that she's engaging with life right now. There is a calling. So some of you listening to this, you are just, everybody's in a difficult marriage from the standpoint of marriage is difficult, but some of you are just in really difficult marriages. There still is such a way for you to honor God through the love and respect that you show each other. Look for the ways that you can say genuine positive things towards each other, and then prayerfully approach each other. And when you're talking about the problems in your marriage, speak with respect and love about what you believe could be in your marriage. Finally, last question that I'll address is just, what if you're already divorced? And this is always a hard thing to talk about when we're talking about marriage and having these sermons from Ephesians about marriage. If somebody's like, I already got divorced. Maybe you're remarried, maybe you're not married, but you're like, I already did the thing that I wasn't supposed to do. I already got divorced, or my marriage is over. Where do I fit in to this whole thing? And what I want to say is that you still have, all of us still have an important role in the life of the church. And when it comes to the whole subject of marriage, a lot of your ability to have a positive and beautiful contribution is going to be based on sort of, number one, how you have sought to heal and grow after your divorce, but then also how you reflect back, not just in your own mind, but how you reflect back to others on your marriage and why it ended in divorce. Now, I don't believe that there's any case where it's like a divorce is 100% one person's fault and 0% another person's fault. But man, there's some where it's like 98%, 2%, where you are by far the wronged person in this situation. Maybe you didn't have any choice in the matter. They just divorced you. Maybe you did initiate the divorce because they were just serially unfaithful and unrepentant, and there was abandonment and just terrible, terrible things. There still is a level of processing that needs to happen. And I think it's important how we talk about our marriages. Phrases that I think that as Christians, we should utterly avoid when we're talking about why our marriages didn't work out. Number one is we should never say, hey, no one should have to stay in an unhappy marriage. That is a terrible thing to say. First of all, because no marriage is happy all the time. And it's one thing to look at it and say, all right, that unhappy marriage, that unhappy state of the marriage is not what God intends. That's true. But sometimes we think, well, the only solution for that is just to get out. Or another one that we'll say is like, hey, we fought so much that it was better that we got divorced than that we stayed together. No, it's not. It wouldn't be good to stay together and fight all the time. It also is not good to get divorced. What is good is to lean into your marriage and find a way to live in harmony with each other as best you can. When we just conclude that was unattainable, we were just two people that couldn't happen, or we say like, we probably never should have got married. It's not that that's never true. Sometimes that is something that you could say to somebody, say, actually, I think we were kind of foolish to get married. The problem with that is then that person that you're talking to that now is going through a rough patch in their marriage, they could look at it and say, well, maybe we were wrong to get married and maybe we just need to correct this mistake. None of that is where we want to be. We also need to avoid saying, well, sometimes things just don't work out. These are all bad things to say for people who are currently going through marriage struggles to hear a divorced person saying. What we need to say is more things like this. I'm so grieved that my marriage ended in divorce. That's not what should have happened. And maybe you can express regret. Maybe you are the one who initiated the divorce and you shouldn't have. And you look back and you say, you know what? I was really wrong in how I did that. And if I could go back and do it again, I wouldn't have done that. Maybe you didn't initiate the divorce, but there's still something where you look back and you say, yeah, I have regrets. Like I have regrets about the way that I treated my wife and neglected her to the point that I don't think that she should have left me, but I kind of understand how we got there. You can reflect on your divorce in a way that's not self-loathing, but is reflecting, this shouldn't have happened. I shouldn't have done that. This isn't God's intention for marriage, and to reflect on the idea of like, there's been a lot of grief for this. Part of the reason why I say this is because you get to be a part. If you do have a divorce in your past, you can be a helpful part in somebody's life of showing that the grass is not greener. Man, when you're in a difficult marriage and you're starting to want out, you can just imagine life will be so much better without this person in my life, or at least in my home. And you have the opportunity to say, you know, that's a lie from the enemy. Persevere in your marriage. Push through. Work things out. Talk to counselors. Talk to pastors. Figure out a way. You have an opportunity to show that the grass is not greener, and to use the example of a grievous thing that either you did or was done to you, however it ended up working out, is truly a grievous thing, and that God's plan for marriage to be marriage for life is something that's good. Even with talking about these 4 questions, there's still tons. And so it's possible there will be a second follow-up podcast episode where we talk more about these things. But my intent in talking about these is to look to bring practical encouragement in our marriages, because marriage is a picture of the gospel, and marriage is also typically going to be a big indicator of how much joy or how much grief we're experiencing in life. And at LBF Church, we want to be a church where marriages are challenging but joyful, and where they show the gospel to the world around us. If you have questions, thoughts, feedback on this episode, you can feel free to leave a comment, and I love to go back and check those comments and engage with people that want to have meaningful engagement. We put out episodes of The Christian Contrast every 2 weeks. You can find them on our website, lbf.church, and you can also find them on our YouTube channel for Life Bible Fellowship Church. If you found this helpful, go back and look at other episodes, because we've got a couple of years of back episodes where we've looked to take on different topics from a biblical standpoint. So we'll be back in 2 weeks with a new episode. Thanks so much for taking the time to listen.